I wanted to talk about the subject of the relationship between realism and restraint and how that applies to great power politics. And I want to proceed with three different parts of the talk. One, I want to talk about realism and what it has to say about great power politics and restraint. Then I want to talk about the post-Cold War period, and then I want to talk about the future. So let me start off by just talking about realism and restraint in theoretical terms. The key thing to understand about realism is that it's a theory of great power politics. It's all about the relationship between the great powers in the system, because realists believe they're the most important actors. And actually, almost all realists believe that minor powers don't matter much at all. And from a realist point of view, the idea of fighting in what's sometimes called the developing world or the third world, or in areas outside of Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf make no sense at all. It's no accident that virtually every realist except Henry Kissinger opposed the Vietnam War. Hans Morgenthau and Walter Lippmann were two of the biggest thorns in the side of LBJ. Ken Waltz was an adamant opponent of the war. Virtually all the realists opposed the Iraq War in 2003. Just stay out of the third world. And it's an argument to just stay out of the third world for two reasons. One, it just doesn't matter strategically. And two, you get yourself into a heck of a lot of trouble. You end up jumping into quagmires. Think of us in Vietnam, think of the Soviets in Afghanistan, and so forth and so on. Second part of my talk, let's talk about the post-Cold War period, pretty much up to the present. If you believe, as the vast majority of people do, that we lived in a unipolar world, or we have lived in a unipolar world, there is by definition one great power in the system. And if there's only one great power in the system, you can't have great power politics, because you need at least two great powers to have great power politics, right? So it's no accident that realism has not held much sway since 1989 or 1991, pick your date, because the United States is the sole pole. Well, from a realist point of view, given the fact that you have one great power and no great power politics, and number two, the developing world or these small countries don't matter much for strategic reasons, you should have had an enormous amount of restraint. All of this is to say that the realism arrow and the restraint arrow are pointing in the same direction. But of course, we know that that is not what happened. And that's in large part because the United States is a country that has liberal imperialism hardwired into its DNA. And in a world where there's a sole pole, and that sole pole is liberal America, it's going to turn into a crusader state almost overnight. And that's what happened. But the realists and the restrainers were on the same side of the debate, and both were pushing to limit the efforts of the crusader state. Now, the question is, where are we headed? And let's start by just assuming that China continues to rise, that the Russians are back from the dead, and we can even throw in Paul's example of the Indians if you want to make it four great powers. But either multipolarity has arrived or it's about to arrive, but it's largely irrelevant for our purposes. The point is, once you're in a multipolar world, great power politics are back on the table, and realism becomes more relevant. So I think given the fact that China is likely to rise over time, the Russians are not likely to go back into chaos as happened in the 1990s, that great power politics is on the table in the future, and realism will have real relevance. The question is, what does this mean for restraint? And I think you could make a good argument that the realism arrow and the restraint arrow stand a good chance of pushing in opposite directions. And the main reason is that if China continues to rise and become really powerful, it will try to throw its weight around in East Asia in ways that will almost certainly cause the United States to put together a balancing coalition to try to contain it, much the way we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. You can already see evidence of this happening in terms of how the Chinese talk about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and so forth and so on. There are all sorts of friction points there. China has declared that it is not a status quo power. It is bent on changing the status quo in East Asia, and the United States, as you all know, is not going to tolerate that. And the pivot to Asia is what that's all about. Well, if that happens, there's not going to be a lot of restraint. So bringing realism back into play with the transition from unipolarity to multipolarity begins to create a situation where there's a real tension between restraint on one hand and realism on the other hand, which again was not the case during the past years since 1989, in large part because we were in a unipolar world. Now let me conclude with one final caveat, and that is that China may not continue to rise. And if China does not continue to rise, when you couple that fact with the fact that Russia is a declining great power, Russia's future is not a bright one. Right, for largely demographic reasons, but also for economic reasons. You could imagine a situation where in the year 2050, the United States is more powerful relative to the other main actors in the system than it is today, or was even in the year 2000. In other words, we're back in a unipolar world, and the realist arrow and the restraint arrow are once again pushing in the same direction. And the question you have to ask yourself is, if we sort of re-enter that world, would we be better able at constraining, defeating, however you want to put it, the Crusaders here in the United States than we were the first time round? And I think the most important reason for being optimistic is basically a learning argument, that we've now run the experiment one time. It was a colossal failure. And number two, all sorts of groups are now beginning to organize, witness this operation today, to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But again, my final point is it may all be irrelevant if China continues to rise, because great power politics will be back on the table in a really intense way, and it'll be much harder to pursue a policy of restraint. Thank you.